Hello and welcome to the Counting the Earth podcast from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. I'm Sue Nelson.
And I'm Alice Hope. Throughout this podcast, we explore the environment and the natural world, but always through the lens of one number.
And today's number is 3.7 million. The estimated area in square kilometres burnt by wildfires in last year's fire season across the globe. Because the focus of this episode is something that's been in the UK media all summer. Wildfires. And it coincides with the publication of the latest report from the State of Wildfires project, which examines extreme wildfires worldwide from March 2024 to February 2025, the main causes and the predictability of those events.
To help us envisage what 3.7 million square kilometres actually looks like, the island of Great Britain is tiny by comparison, only around 209,000 square kilometres, and mainland France is just over 500,000 square kilometres. But the global burnt area in last year's fire season was way bigger than that. The nearest equivalent size in terms of a country is actually India, which is around 3.3 million square kilometres. So last year's cumulative burnt area is bigger than India.
Wow.
And we are talking about a lot of land burnt in wildfires in just 12 months.
Well, in a moment, we'll be digging into that report in more detail with its lead author, Doug Kelley from UKCEH. But before we go global, we wanted to start local and explore what this current year in wildfires has been like in the UK so far, because it's already been an exceptional year and 2025 isn't over yet.
Traditionally, the fire season in the UK is weighted towards the spring. The weather's warming up, there's less rain, and the previous year's vegetation has dried off and is lovely and crispy and dried out. Also, people are starting to get out and about again, so that creates opportunities to spark a fire. And this year in the UK, we had twice as many incidents in the first 6 months as any year on record.
Those fires weren't confined to the traditional fire season either. As a result of the driest spring in more than 50 years, followed by 4 heat waves over the summer, new vegetation dried out quickly, and we've had report after report of wildfires. These included a huge incident on the North York Moors National Park, stretching across 10 square miles and burning for over a month, as well as the shocking sight of a blaze on Arthur's Seat, which sounds a bit rude, but it's actually that gorse-covered remains of an ancient volcano in the heart of Edinburgh.
I wanted to see the kind of impacts these fires can have firsthand, so I popped down to Dorset, where they've had a number of big incidents this summer. I met up with Dorset and Wiltshire firefighter Andy Elliott on Holt Heath near Wimborne, a site that suffered a big blaze in August earlier this year. You've brought me to an area that was burned, and I have to say it almost looks like an alien landscape, very barren with these almost skeletal branches. Can you describe what happened here?
Yeah, we had a very significant fire here on Holt Heath. It covered 72 hectares, and it was a very intense fire, but also a very severe fire. So the severity is how much damage did it do, and you can see by looking around there is nothing left on the ground. We've got a few remains of burnt out gorse bushes, but even the soil has been burnt away here in most places, so it's down to bare sand and bare gravel and just crunchy remains of vegetation.
It is bizarrely crunchy. It almost feels like walking on charcoal or something like that.
Well, effectively it is. What's left on the ground is the remains of dwarf shrubs, things like heathers, as well as gorse. There's 3 species of gorse here. They all crunch down into tiny little particles of charcoal, and that is exactly what you're walking on.
If there's no soil here, is this landscape going to recover?
Eventually it will recover into some form of heathland. We're unsure what that may look like. It'll take probably around 30 years before it returns anywhere close to what it was before. Some areas where we are just on sand and gravel, that may never recover. It may remain just as sand.
Gosh, that just goes to show, I suppose, how devastating these wildfires can be in the sense that they can permanently change the landscape.
Yeah, we think that may well be a consequence of climate change. It's not something we've seen in the past have this degree of severity where we've completely lost all of the soil. That means the seed bed is gone. There is nothing left. It is just sand and gravels, the mineral soil beneath.
So you said it was a 72 hectare fire. What kind of resource do you need to fight a fire like that? I mean, how many crews had to come out?
This was initially fought on the first couple of days, got 20 fire engines. So there's a huge resource to come and deal with a fire of this size. And of course, at that moment in time, Dorset and Wiltshire Fire and Rescue Service were already under pressure with another significant wildfire. The crews in Dorset and Wiltshire were exhausted. Many were on-call staff, so the majority of personnel across the UK actually are on-call firefighters. They come in when they're required, and they have other jobs to do as well. So you can imagine they're fighting fires weekends, night time, coming away from their place of work and fighting fires. There's a limit to how long you can keep that up and sustain that.
So obviously a big impact on people. What's the impact been like on wildlife?
72 hectares, that's a significant area that's completely destroyed. But it sits within a 500 hectare heathland site. So there's still 400 plus hectares of good quality lowland heath intact. So much of the wildlife will relocate. But the timing of the incident, there was still plenty of reptiles around, lots of small mammals, birds, the invertebrates. Many of those will have succumbed to the fire on the day. We can walk around and pick up particularly dead reptiles, but also dead birds were being picked up by crews. But we also put some effort in with colleagues from the countryside managers around and about, and we were able to rescue quite a large number of living reptiles that were relocated back onto the good quality unburnt heathland.
You've been a firefighter in the Dorset and Wiltshire service for a long time. How long have you been in service for?
I'm now in my 43rd operational year, so it's quite a big chunk of my life.
Have you seen incidents like this increase over that time?
I think overall the number of incidents perhaps hasn't increased that much. It's the type of incidents we're now responding to. These are much more intense incidents. The vegetation is often drier. We're going through periods of drought now, so they're much more difficult to tackle. So the size of these incidents is increasing, but it's the intensity which is best described as the length of the flames. That makes it very difficult and challenging for firefighters to actually extinguish the fire quickly and safely. These are dangerous incidents, so we need to take into account people's safety.
Wildfires have been in the UK media all summer. What's this year been like?
Well, it has been a very challenging summer. We had a dry spring. The year before was actually relatively wet, which means more fuel grows. The vegetation grows and responds well in the wet years, and that becomes fuel in a dry year. So this year has been very dry. On average, it's been hotter than we would normally expect. Because the drought runs through into the summer, that means that the vegetation dries out quite rapidly, and the biggest challenge to us is not so much the temperature of the day. That's physically challenging for firefighters, but from a vegetation perspective, it's the lack of rainfall that means the vegetation dries out, and it's what's known as the fuel moisture content that becomes very low. The grasses cure or dry off much more earlier than they normally would, so all the fuel is dry and ready to burn. So when there is an ignition source, that's why we get these high intensity fires and very, very difficult to deal with.
This is Counting the Earth, so let's talk numbers. How does your year at Dorset and Wiltshire compare to the national picture that we're seeing across the country?
Every fire and rescue service across the country has seen an increase in fires this year. We've had very nearly 1,000 vegetation fires across Dorset and Wiltshire. We measure all vegetation fires, so very small fires up to the very large ones, which is an increase on an average year. But we're finding we're getting close to these numbers more frequently than we did. But the key change is the number of larger fires. So the wildfires become recognised when they hit one of 6 criteria. One of those, for example, is a fire greater than a hectare, or it may be that it requires more than 6 pumping appliances. And we've hit many more of those bigger fires. That's the key difference. In Dorset and Wiltshire area, we've had around 100 wildfires that have hit one of those bigger trigger points.
Wow. How does that compare to across the rest of the UK?
For England and Wales, up until the end of August, there were 995 significant wildfires, which is quite a step increase on average figures. Previously, we would expect to record about 300 or 400 fires in a typical year. We are finding that number is increasing year on year. That's partly due to the weather and the conditions. It's also partly due to the way that these fires have been recorded. So fire services are getting better at recognising and recording these fires. But this year is certainly the record year for us for the significant wildfires.
You mentioned a driving factor of the weather there. Are there any other things that are driving this change across the UK and Europe?
Well, land management practice is key. There are, certainly across Europe, there's a lot of land abandonment for agricultural reasons. People are moving off the mountains, off the hills into the towns for an easier life, effectively, which means that landscape is now unmanaged, so the fuel is allowed to grow unchecked. Previously it was grazed by animals and managed by people, which kept the fuel under control. So that's a significant factor across Europe. We are seeing similar changes across the UK with different changes in land management practice. We're seeing a move towards rewilding, for example. Fuel needs to be managed as part of that. If you just abandon landscapes and allow them to grow, then that generates a huge amount of fuel, which will burn at some point. Now, rewilding isn't just about land abandonment, it does include management as well, but we're still trying to understand exactly what that means. But also agriculture is changing as well. And a lot of the fires are agricultural fires as well. So it's not just heathland and moorland that burns. Big parts of the landscape that are under arable cultivation are burning now as well, for the same reasons, very dry fuels. And the process of harvesting can generate fires through friction and so on.
Obviously here we're in a fairly remote location and we heard a lot about the fires on the North York moors this year. But are we seeing more risk to homes and sort of urban areas as these wildfires become more intense?
Yeah, a lot of the fires are in what we call the rural-urban interface now. This is partly because we're moving towards a more Mediterranean-style climate. So we're getting these longer, drier summers, and grasses now are involved. Traditionally, the fire season for the UK is in the spring. So it's mostly moorland and heathland vegetation types, and the remains of dry vegetation from the winter. What we're now seeing is the grasses, etc., they grow through the spring, then they dry out very rapidly and they catch fire. So this takes us to that urban interface. These are perhaps urban parks and so on. And when they catch fire, which they will, they're in close proximity to homes and can threaten homes. And again, in 2022, in England, 95 structures were lost to wildfires. We lost one structure here on Holt Heath this year, but others have been lost across the UK again this year, which is a new trend. We don't normally expect to lose structures and homes in the UK to wildfires, but we will see more of that. There's also a need for homeowners to be aware of what they can do themselves, and the Firewise UK project is a really good way for them. It raises awareness. It's simple things like clearing the debris out of your gutters when the weather is dry and when wildfires are likely to happen, so that you don't get embers dropping onto your roof, into your gutter and setting fire to your structure. Clearing away any flammable vegetation, sweeping leaves away, clearing flammable furniture, for example, away from your home, so that if there is a fire, it doesn't add fuel load right next to your home. And also managing the space around your home. All of that's available through the Firewise UK programme.
Thank you again to Andy Elliott for giving us his time. I found that landscape, it was almost like being on an alien planet. I've never stood somewhere like that where the soil is just completely gone. I didn't even think about that being a possibility, that the wildfire could just burn the soil away to the point that nothing can grow there anymore. It was really shocking, actually.
Well, even the sounds of it, the crunching sound, when I heard you, I thought, this is weird. What on earth are they walking on? Because it was a very distinctive sound and really conveyed how brittle and dry, effectively, that must have been. Because I have been where people do controlled wildfires before, but it's not sounded like that.
No, it was this sort of black desert landscape. And I can see why people become sort of almost quite emotional about it. You know, if there's this place that you've grown up in, maybe you've walked the dog there and it's been a very special place for you.
Well, especially if it's green, and gorse, as we know, has got those lovely sort of yellow flowers. And then you're talking about the charcoal reference really stuck with me, actually, because you just thought, whoa, because that's sort of really black, dull, And to have that instead of nature's wonderful variety and shades of green, yeah, you can see why it would shock people. That's not normal, is it? This is something slightly unusual.
No, the thing that was particularly devastating about that fire was the heat and the severity and the intensity of the flames. It meant that it stayed in the same place for quite a long time and it really burnt through the material. That's rare in the UK, but something that we're seeing increasingly with climate change. So something I think we're going to have to almost get a bit more used to.
Now, it was interesting hearing you and Andy talk about how changes in land use across Europe are increasing fire risks in rural areas. I hadn't really considered this before, but with people moving from hillsides into towns, leaving land that would have previously been grazed to go unmanaged, you can see how it allows fuel to grow unchecked. And so it's clearly an increased risk. And it reminded me of a fire prevention scheme that I'd read about before this podcast in Catalonia in Spain. It was called the Fire Flock scheme. I'm not going to say what it was in Catalonian, the words for that, but basically nomadic shepherds coordinate with firefighters to graze flocks of sheep and goats in areas that have got really high density undergrowth that's a higher fire risk. So goats can munch through undergrowth pretty quickly, and so they reduce fuel in these high risk areas, and it helps the shepherds increase their income as well, because they can then sell their meat and cheese at a premium because they're taking part in a scheme that helps preserve the environment but also upholds traditional agriculture, which I thought was pretty much win-win.
Absolutely. It doesn't always require buying more helicopters, for example, to fight wildfires when there are natural ways to lower the risk.
Meh.
So there we go. Use goats, use sheep. We definitely need to think differently about how we manage the land and the fire risks in the future under a changed climate. That was something that Andy and I discussed in the second half of our interview, which is coming up later. A bit of a teaser for you there.
But first, let's zoom out and talk about the global picture and the report that this episode of Counting the Earth is centred upon. Published in Earth System Science Data, the latest report from the State of Wildfires project is co-led by the University of East Anglia, the Met Office, the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasts, and of course the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. Its aim is to pull together the global data on the big wildfire events and give an annual health check of the world's fire season. To get more detail, we spoke to UKCEH senior scientist and lead author Doug Kelley. And despite how big 3.7 million square kilometres sounds, surprisingly, it wasn't an exceptional year.
This is the weird, interesting thing about fires. If you look at the amount of fires worldwide, we're actually seeing a decrease most years. And that's because some parts of the world which see regular burning and where the ecosystems and the people have adapted to that fire, we're actually seeing less burnt area there. And that's because people tend to fragment the landscape. They kind of break it up when they convert it to agriculture. They try and stop fires because they don't want their agricultural land burning down. But the big fires that cause the most impacts, ones like we saw in Australia a few years ago, where we've seen the Amazon this year and Canada last year, they're having a disproportionate impact compared to the river fires. And you can see that in lots of different ways in terms of how intense they are, how many people they affect, how many properties they destroy, and even how much carbon emissions we see.
So with the amount of burnt area being slightly less than normal, and, even though it's a huge number we've got as our headline figure, does that mean the amount of carbon that's been emitted by wildfires during this period in the report, that's gone down as well?
No, so actually, although the global burnt area has gone down, that's affecting a lot of places which don't have as much carbon, grasslands and tropical savannas, which are important for the world's carbon stores themselves, but they don't have as much carbon as forests. And actually, we're seeing an increase in burnt area in forests over this period. And actually, last year, we still saw 2.2 billion tonnes of carbon released, which is roughly about 9% above the long-term average that we've seen in the last couple of decades. So there's indications that the amount of carbon released by fires is going up, even though the amount of area burned is going down.
Alongside all that carbon, when there's a wildfire, obviously it generates a lot of smoke as well. And there must be massive health implications for that?
Yes, so fires cause emissions of particles called PM2.5. The 2.5 comes from the size of the particle, but they're really bad for health. They can really get into people's lungs, and they can cause really bad respiratory diseases. And you actually see a huge increase in hospitalizations for people with respiratory diseases around about the same time as fires. This year was particularly bad, particularly in Southern California, where pollution from these particles peaked at 30 times what was kind of deemed the safe daily limit by the World Health Organization. In Bolivia, it was even worse. It was 60 times higher than safe limits there as well. And this would have caused particularly people who suffer from respiratory problems already to have more ill health and end up in hospitals, and eventually would have led to some people dying.
So you've said, obviously, we're seeing a change in where some of these fires are happening. We're moving from savannas into more forests. Are we seeing any other changes in the nature of wildfires, and do we know what's causing that?
Yeah, so fires across the globe, especially extreme fires, tend to be getting hotter, bigger, and much harder to tackle as well because of that. And the overwhelming cause of this is climate change. Climate change can often make conditions hotter and drier, and that's often where you see more fires.
It's also about timing, isn't it? Because fires in Southern California and around LA and Hollywood in January, they happened at a time of year that actually took quite a few people by surprise.
Normally in that time of year, it would be wet. So you'd have rain coming in. The area would just be too wet to burn. There was a very wet year the year before. So there was a lot of extra vegetation in the area where you would normally expect to not have quite as much fuel. And it had a good few months to be able to build up, and then rapidly dried out coming into the autumn and winter, which meant that the fires were able to take hold in this really big area of biomass that had dried out. But it's also the time of year where you get some really, really strong winds as well. So the fact that the rains failed this year and we did have all this high buildup of fuel and a very dry fuel meant that it happened at the same time where we had winds that could actually blow them as well.
So that sort of climate change, adjusting the timing, made it worse effectively, because you've got the wind effectively fanning the flames.
Yeah. One of the main reasons they're so destructive is where they were. It's really kind of got into the suburbs of LA. The area does see fires sometimes, but they don't normally make it quite so far into populated areas.
It was in a very densely populated area, and over 11,000 homes were destroyed. What kind of impact does that have on people and the local economy there?
There'd been rises in employment rates because all of a sudden a large part of the suburb where people got hired, there weren't jobs going anymore. And when you take 11,000 homes in an area where you already have a housing crisis, where you have a shortage of housing for people, that ripple effect affects everybody, and you start seeing rises in homelessness. And actually in 2018, there were some big fires in Northern California, the Camp Fires. And there's a lot of research showing that homelessness has increased right across the state because of those fires, even for people who weren't actually affected by those fires as well. It makes house prices more expensive, and it kind of starts pricing people out of being able to afford homes.
Were there other parts of the Americas that fared as badly or even worse than that?
Yeah, actually in South America, there was lots of big fires as well. The Amazon saw loads of fires last year, which was damaging the forest there. And the Pantanal, which is the world's biggest tropical wetlands, this is an area which is normally by definition wet and hard to burn, also saw extreme fires in 2024 as well.
To be honest, I feel ashamed. I've heard of the Amazon, but I'd not heard of Pantanal.
It's a really interesting area, and actually I hadn't heard of it until a few years ago as well.
Oh good, that makes me feel a bit better.
The Pantanal itself does sometimes burn naturally. There is a dry season where some of the wetlands can dry out a little bit, and you do get some fires as well. It won't burn anywhere that's still wet, but there are areas around the side of the wetlands where you can sometimes experience fire. It's being hit with increased hot temperatures and increased drought over the last few years, and that is overwhelmingly because of climate change. But it's not just climate change that's impacting this region as well. It's a really interesting mix of people and climate change. So the Pantanal, the wetlands, is fed by rivers flowing off from some of the local mountains and hills, and people are extracting water from those rivers. Because of that water extraction and because of how people are managing the landscape around there anyway, we also see more fires because of people. And it's this interesting interaction between using the local resources and the fact that temperatures are getting hotter and drier, and the wetlands are drying out more easily because of climate change, which is causing these big fires as well.
And just to make this clear as well, that Pantanal, it covers 3 countries, I believe. It's Brazil, Bolivia and Paraguay.
Yes, yeah.
So we're talking about a very large area here.
Yeah, we are. And although last year was the biggest, it's not the first year they've been hit by big climate-related fires as well. So 2020 was also a big year for the region. And this is the worrying sign that we're seeing these repeated fires in some of these places where you wouldn't normally see burning in the past. The major fires across the Americas last year, which include LA, Northeast Amazon, and the Pantanal, were roughly 30 times larger because of climate change.
A very large wetland like that, it's not a particularly inhabited area, but it's home to 4,700 animal and plant species, the biggest parrot on the planet, the hyacinth macaw and caimans and jaguars. And because of that, it attracts around 1 million tourists a year. So while it's easy to think that it might not be as destructive as a fire in a more populated area, actually, these fires do have a massive impact on people and animals and wildlife.
Yeah, as you just mentioned, the Pantanal is a bit of a biodiversity hotspot. It ranges the jaguar, which is a very iconic species for South America. But if you start destroying a lot of that wetland, then you're seeing a lot of losses of species that you don't necessarily see anywhere else in the world, as is a lot of the places in South America which are experiencing these fires as well. And I think it's kind of an aspect that doesn't get as much attention because it's not the big smoke. And you're right, it's not hitting the suburbs of a major city, but it is still a major impact that people, I guess, should consider more.
You've mentioned how, there were some unusual circumstances for the Hollywood one where it came at a time in January which wasn't expected, and it was a time when there was the Santa Ana wind, and so that will have fueled the flames quite literally. So is that a one-off then, in that it was unusual in terms of timing, but obviously climate change is going to affect the timing of things like this, or are we likely to see more events like this at unexpected times and maybe unexpected places as well?
We are going to see more events like this, and actually a lot of the places where we've looked at what our future projections of the climate look like do show increases in these type of events as well. Southern California is a bit of an interesting place because it's very hard to see kind of how winter rainfall and winter vegetation is going to develop in the future. So that's a little less certain than a lot of parts of the world. But if you look at most other places, then these kind of unusual events at a time of year where you wouldn't normally see fires, much bigger and more intense than normal, we're seeing this increases in most of the places we look at in our future projections of climate as well.
Which makes it really difficult then to prepare for wildfires.
It makes it difficult, but not impossible. There's things we can do. I mean, the big thing we can do is start reducing our carbon emissions and actually try and meet some of these big international targets like Paris. Our projections show that you actually have a lot less big fires in the future if we start cutting our emissions now, if we start kind of trying to target this 1 or 1.5 or 2 degrees that we've set ourselves. But we will still see an increase even with those. It won't be as bad, but there will be more fires even under reduced carbon emissions.
Given that the levels of risk are increasing and these events are likely to become more common, how do we improve the early warning systems for wildfires moving forward?
It is really tricky, and it's because fires are this product of so many different drivers. So, the hot, dry weather, the amount of fuel, something there to actually start the fires in the first place. There are some promising tools coming forward, particularly with our partners at the Met Office and the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecast, ECMWF. They've been developing some really interesting machine learning and AI techniques that can bring in all those different aspects. They can bring in the dry weather that we traditionally might use from a regular forecast, along with information about how the fuels are interacting and all these other meteorological conditions, the winds, which are improving the forecast and actually giving us a better idea about where the risks might be higher. But there's other areas we should look to improve as well. So kind of more international collaboration on firefighting, for example. If we can share resources more when there are big fires, then that kind of helps us tackle fires in the first place. But there's also preparation. There's kind of ways you manage the landscape beforehand. We did something work with the UN Environmental Programme a couple of years ago looking at how we can prepare for more wildfires. And a lot of these things about kind of sharing resources and sharing information across countries was one of the main things that they recommended for that, because it feels like there's the knowledge and the resources there to at least not necessarily kind of tackle them completely, but at least kind of alleviate some of their impacts. And I think that international collaboration across firefighters, across research organizations, and on working on like these forecasts as well is going to be the way to help with some of these increases in fire we're going to see.
UKCEH senior scientist and lead author of the report, Doug Kelley.
I was really struck by the health impacts of wildfires. Everyone knows that they cause a lot of environmental destruction or they might burn down buildings, but actually the fact that not only do they impact health so much, but that even if they're several miles away, because that pollution travels so far, it can still affect people.
Oh, yeah. And I actually saw that firsthand because I was in California when the wildfires were happening.
Oh, gosh.
And I was miles away. California is a huge state. And the air, normally at that time of year, it's fairly clear. The air was just awful and grey, and you could see it in the distance coming, and it was like bits of ash as well everywhere. It's worrying when you see the sky change and you see the air become filled with tiny little particles, and you can feel it on the back of your throat as well. So it is quite scary, and knowing that conditions, particularly with climate change, are going to make these sort of events more likely. I think the other thing that surprised me was when he said that actually there was more carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere, 9% above average as well. I don't want to sound all doom and gloom, but it's something that people have to take seriously.
Doug there was talking about what fires will probably look like in the future as the climate continues to change. And this is something that's very much on the minds of UK firefighters as well. After showing me the devastation wrought on part of Holt Heath in Dorset, Andy Elliott took me to another section of the Heath, which had been burnt in a previous year, but that area told a very different story.
We've now moved across into the part of the Holt Heath that wasn't affected this summer, and we've stood on an old fire scar. So we had a fire here perhaps 2 or 3 years ago. It was a totally different type of fire. So this is a much more traditional fire. This is what we used to get. This is what we had in the past on a regular basis, a springtime fire. And you can see that the soil is still present. There are lots and lots of shoots and regeneration of heather. The old heather plants are still in place, but there's no vegetation on them. So they weren't consumed by the fire, but they were largely killed by the fire. This is part of a long-standing process. This is how heathlands were created. Fire was part of their management in the past. And part of the consequence is where the fuel is not managed, there is a higher fuel load. And with climate change coming in, giving us these longer, hot, very dry summers, one of the consequences is when we get a fire in the summer, it will burn all of the plants, it will burn the root system, it will burn the soil. We're getting away from those traditional fires, and the scar we're stood in now is a great example. It's covered in heather that is recently flowered, just gone over now, and give this another 5-10 years and it'll just be a lovely patch of heather in very good condition.
Looking at it now, thinking that this is still affected even 2 or 3 years later and isn't going to look the same as the surrounding area for another 10 years is quite astonishing. But you mentioned that's part of the management, and your day job is to train other people about how to manage fire, is that right?
Yes, so I run a wildfire training and consultancy business. So I teach people how to suppress fires, how to understand wildfires, but also how to use fire in the landscapes.
You don't just do that in the UK, you do this across the globe as well. What kind of changes are we seeing to wildfires globally?
I do travel around, and it's really important to go and see what other people do and look at challenges of other countries. We know, for example, that with climate change, we will be moving towards a Mediterranean climate. So studying fire behaviour in the Mediterranean climate now in Mediterranean countries will help us understand what our future looks like. So lots that we can learn from that process.
When I think of a firefighter, I think of someone turning up at someone's house because their toaster's caught fire or something like that. What's the difference in fighting a wildfire versus fighting a fire at a property?
It's potential, really. If you have a fire in a structure, it's got normally 4 walls, and generally speaking that fire will remain within those 4 walls. So it doesn't tend to spread much beyond that. It is relatively predictable. Wildfires are also predictable, but in a different landscape scale. So they all start very small, but given the right conditions, given the right amount of fuel, they can grow to very large areas. So when you're dealing and managing wildfires, you need to look at the fuel, you need to consider what the weather is doing, you need to consider how the landscape will impact that fire.
It must be quite different for the people involved as well. If you pull up at a residential street, you've got a road, you've got access to water, 72 hectares in the middle of a wild space. How do you get your trucks on, and how easy is it for the people who are actually fighting that fire?
Wildfires do have some fairly unique challenges for firefighters. Access is one of them. We need to just leave our vehicles on the roadside and then carry our equipment in. But also individually for the firefighters, many firefighters are working in what we call structural PPE. This is designed to protect them if they go into a building that's on fire. But if you're in an open habitat and you're wearing that same protective clothing, It gets very, very hot. It's designed to keep heat out, but it also keeps heat in. It's your body heat that's the problem. So actually managing the health and well-being of firefighters becomes a real challenge at wildfire incidents.
There's also a land management challenge here as well, isn't there, as things change?
There is. Land managers, obviously the crews in the top, they manage the land and the landscapes that we enjoy so much. They have to work within the law and the constraints of the law and what they can and cannot do. And they're doing their very best to make sure that we've got a landscape that is attractive, that's beneficial to wildlife and biodiversity, but that also doesn't pose an additional threat to people that live in and around it. And if the landscapes are managed inappropriately, they can become quite a fire risk, a significant risk to people's homes. So land managers are looking to change the way they manage the landscapes. They're zoning their landscapes into different risks. They're creating fire breaks and fuel breaks across the landscape. But they also are assisting very much in the response phase. So during a wildfire incident, land managers have equipment that firefighters simply don't have access to. So we're increasingly seeing the land management sector assisting the fire and rescue service, and many of them are now becoming trained in wildfire response, so they can assist in a very structured way that's controlled and that is safe for everybody.
What is it that the general public can do to try and prevent wildfires from happening in the first place?
Well, we know that in the UK that the vast majority, almost all wildfires are human started, whether that's deliberate or accidental or just part of an agricultural process. We need to understand what the causes are. We need to then take some sensible steps. For members of the public out and about, it's about taking care and, for example, not using disposable barbecues or having campfires in open countryside. The kind of summer we've had this year, we don't want to be seeing people with naked flames of any kind in the countryside. The risks are just too high.
Dorset and Wiltshire firefighter Andy Elliott, I found talking to him really, really fascinating, and the landscape very fascinating as well. I hadn't really appreciated the time scales that we're talking about when we talk about wildfire, whether it's a burn that happens accidentally or one of the burns that they use to manage the heathland. Naively, I'd thought that these places would recover fairly quickly. Having seen an area that had been burned a number of years ago, it still looked sort of visibly very different, which then when I think about how damaged the first area was, the kind of timescales that we're talking to get that resembling anything close to the area around it is decadal.
The other sobering thought was when Andy said that most wildfires in the UK are started by people. It could be by accident. As we know, it does sometimes happen on purpose. And there was some good advice there about what we can actually do to avoid inadvertently starting fires. Well, what, where and how much was burnt by wildfires each year is a complex and shifting global picture. But the report's overall conclusion is clear, that the frequency and intensity of extreme wildfires will increase by the end of the century because of human-driven climate change.
And that's something those on the front line of firefighting, even in the UK, are already experiencing. Standing in Dorset with Andy in that blackened landscape on Holt Heath really brought home to me the concerns for the future that are laid out in this report. Fires of such intensity that even the soil is burned away are a really grim prospect.
Yes, and when we started thinking about this episode back in the spring, we had no idea then how relevant and personal it would also feel to a UK audience, or that this would be such a big year for wildfires here in Britain, where they're not traditionally a huge feature of our environment. But the numbers so far point to a likely record-breaking year. A reminder then of our headline number. Globally, 3.7 million square kilometres of land burnt by wildfires in last year's fire season. And in some places like the Americas, that was exacerbated by human-driven climate change. With no apparent break on this long-term shift in the Earth's average temperatures and weather conditions, we're all going to have to get smarter in mitigating and managing the wildfire risk around the globe as these exceptional events become a regular occurrence.
Thank you for listening to Counting the Earth, and please join us again next time for another look at nature through numbers.